Hello and welcome back to The Convict Diaries. Bushranging in Australia started when they began to bring over convicts from Britain on the First Fleet. Originally known as convict bolters, convicts like John Black Caesar vanished into the bush around the Sydney settlement. Later, some bushrangers would strike fear in some citizens and fascination in others. However, some bushranger stirred a sense of respect and honour from their fellow citizens. Today we will look at one of the last bushrangers. Jimmy Governor, the complex legacy of an Australian bushranger. The story of Jimmy Governor, one of Australia's most infamous bushrangers, is a tale of violence, injustice, and the harsh realities of colonial Australia. His life and crimes, which culminated in a brutal killing spree in 1900, have left a lasting impact on Australian history. Governor's story is not just one of criminality but also a reflection of the racial and social tensions of the time, offering a window into the struggles faced by Indigenous Australians in a rapidly changing and often hostile society. Jimmy Governor was born in 1875 at Walla, on the Talbraga River near Denison Town, colony of New South Wales. His father was an Indigenous Australian named Tommy Governor or perhaps Grosvenor, born 1834 and died 23 November 1900, and his mother's name was Annie Fitzgerald, born 1850 and died 1915. As a mixed-race individual, Jimmy grew up in a society that marginalised and discriminated against Indigenous people. Despite these challenges, he was known to be hard-working and skilled, often employed as a stockman and labourer. Jimmy Governor's father, originally from the Namwa River region, was known for his strong work ethic and intelligence. He had settled in the Mudgee area during the 1850s. Jimmy's mother, raised northeast of Mendoran, was the daughter of Jack Fitzgerald, an Irish stockman, and an Aboriginal woman named Polly, who worked as a house servant. It seems the children were probably Tommy Jr., Abe, Abraham, Alice, Jimmy, Totty, Joe, Dinah, Charles, Jane, Roy. I'm not sure which of their children survived, but Totty gets married. Dinah has a son in 1907. In 1957 Roy, who has spent time in and out of jail, dies in Peak Hill. Joe was probably born in 1877. Jimmy's mixed heritage and large family shaped his early life, placing him at the intersection of the Indigenous and the colonial Australian experiences. In 1887, Tommy was repairing a dam east of Dunedoo, when he discovered samples of metal-bearing ore. He showed these to George Stewart, the manager of Pine Ridge Station, who had them assayed. The tests revealed the presence of silver, prompting Stewart to secure mineral leases covering 70 acres and form a company with Mudgee businessmen to develop what became known as the Mount Stewart Mine. In 1888, as Tommy and his family prepared to move to the Paterson River District, the original promoters of the Mount Stewart and Grosvenor leases presented him with a purse of sovereigns as a token of appreciation for his discovery. However, the fact that Tommy received no substantial financial benefit from the silver field he had uncovered remained a lasting source of bitterness for him. After the Governor family relocated in 1888, Tommy and his sons found work on stations along the Paterson River, west of Dungog. However, their labour was often compensated only with rations, leaving them in a precarious financial situation. Over time, the family became increasingly entangled in the Aboriginal Reserve System, a government initiative designed to segregate and control Indigenous people by isolating them from the white population. In January 1890, members of the family participated in a community event at Gresford, but by July of that year, they were living in tents on the St Clair Reserve, north of Singleton. In August 1890, Tommy Governor participated in a violent altercation at the Singleton Blacks camp during which he stabbed another Aboriginal man. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of malicious wounding at the Singleton Quarter Sessions. Sentenced to 3 months of hard labour in Maitland Gaol, Tommy served his time and, upon release, moved his family back to the Gulgong district. There, they settled on the Aboriginal Reserve in the police paddock, just across the creek from Walla Township. This period marked a turbulent chapter in the family's life, as they struggled to navigate the oppressive systems and social challenges of the time. The schooling of the 8 Governor children was inconsistent due to the family's unstable circumstances. Jimmy, the eldest, attended schools in Denison Town, Walla, and possibly Gulgong, Coonabarabran, and Lynbrook. A former classmate recalled that Jimmy and his brothers Joe and Jackie could read and write reasonably well. Jimmy was described as smart, athletic, and cheerful, while Joe was seen as a tough child. In 1883, a precedent was set in Yass when white parents objected to Indigenous children attending the local public school. The Minister of Public Instruction, George Reid, upheld the decision to exclude them, establishing a policy in New South Wales that allowed local objections to bar Aboriginal children from schools. By age 15, Jimmy was working as a tree lopper in the Dunedoo district. He and his brother Joe later took on various jobs, including fencing, mustering stock, and breaking horses, in the Allen River and Singleton areas. Inspired by his father's work ethic, Jimmy resolved to earn wages rather than accept rations or handouts. At his trial, he proudly stated, "I was never a loafer like some black fellows," adding, "I always worked, and paid for what I got, and I reckon I am as good as a white man." Jimmy's first notable brush with the law occurred in February 1893 when he was convicted of stealing, possibly horse sweating, or riding a horse without permission, and sentenced to 1 month in prison. By the mid-1890s, with his family living on the Waller Aboriginal Reserve, Jimmy worked on local stations. In July 1896, he joined the New South Wales Mounted Police as a tracker in Cassilis but left after 17 months. A police officer claimed Jimmy resigned after seducing a selector's daughter, though a subsequent review revealed broader issues within the Cassilis police station. While cutting wood for a man named Starr, Jimmy Governor met 15-year-old Ethel Page, who worked at Ryan's Bakery in Gulgong. Ethel, born in 1882 near Kempsey in the Macleay River District, was the eldest daughter of Charles Page and Julia, née Moore. Her family had moved to the Gulgong area around 1890, and they were living northwest of Gulgong on the Junee-Dubbo Road. In August 1898, Ethel became pregnant by Jimmy. The couple married in December at St. Luke's Anglican Church Rectory in Gulgong, with Jimmy wearing a borrowed white cricket suit. Reports later claimed that the officiating minister, Reverend Haviland, agreed to the ceremony only at the insistence of Ethel's mother, who sought to protect her daughter's reputation. One account harshly criticised Ethel's mother, questioning her judgment for allowing her daughter to marry a low-bred savage Aboriginal. When asked if she regretted marrying an Aboriginal man, Ethel simply replied, "You might think so, but I was very fond of Jimmy." After their marriage, Jimmy and Ethel lived near her parents in the Gulgong district, where Ethel gave birth to their son, Sydney, in early April 1899. Ethel's father disapproved of the union and eventually moved to Dubbo, with the rest of the family following later. By the end of 1899, after enduring a year of scorn and disapproval from Ethel's family and the Gulgong community, Jimmy decided to leave the district with his family in search of a fresh start. Jimmy and Ethel arrived at Morby's property in January 1900. The Breelong Massacre. Jimmy and his brother Joe had been working as fencing contractors for the Morbys, but tensions arose over unpaid wages and mistreatment. After a confrontation with the Morbys, during which Jimmy and his family were subjected to racial slurs and abuse. On the evening of Friday, July 20, 1900, tensions boiled over at Jimmy and Ethel Governor's camp. Jimmy, deeply agitated, accused Ethel and his brother Joe of being romantically involved. During the heated argument, the conversation shifted to the Morbys, the family for whom Jimmy had worked. According to Jimmy's later testimony at his trial, Ethel provoked him by saying, "They rub it in, they do as they like with you." Jimmy responded, "You come down and I will see about it." He then recounted, "So we got ready and made off, me and my wife, Joe, and Jackie Underwood." By this time, it was late, between 10 and 11 o'clock. The group set out with at least 2 weapons. Underwood carried a rifle and a tomahawk, while Jimmy had a boondi, a hardwood club. Notably, they had no bullets or gunpowder, suggesting the weapons were intended more for intimidation than actual use. This moment marked the beginning of a tragic and violent chain of events that would forever alter their lives. The group first went to the Old Inn, where John Morby, his brother-in-law Fred Clark, and the 2 eldest Morby sons were staying. Jimmy and another man, likely Underwood, approached the inn and called for Morby, who came outside. Jimmy asked him for a bag of flour and a bag of sugar. Morby responded that he would give them the supplies the next day. According to Jimmy's account, he returned to where the others were waiting and told his wife, "I'm going to see Mrs. Morby about those words she's been saying. I'll make her think twice about what she's talking about." The group then walked to the Morby house so Jimmy could confront Mrs. Morby. Jimmy claimed that when Mrs. Morby and Kurz came to the door, he asked, "Did you tell my wife that any white woman who married a black man ought to be shot? Did you ask her about our private business? Did you ask her whether I had black or white nature?" According to Jimmy, the women responded with a sneering laugh, prompting him to strike Mrs. Morby in the mouth. Kurz then reportedly said, "Pooh, you black rubbish, you deserve to be shot for marrying a white woman." Jimmy hit Kurz on the jaw, knocking her down. In his own words, he lost control and started hammering them, overcome by anger. Mrs. Morby suffered fatal injuries from 5 deep gashes to her neck and head, inflicted by Jimmy. Kurz and 16-year-old Grace Morby fled to an adjoining bedroom where 11-year-old Hilda Morby and Elsie Clark were sleeping. Meanwhile, 3 boys, Percy Morby 14, Bert Morby 9, and their cousin George 13, were awakened by the commotion. Jack hid under a bed, while Percy attempted to confront the attackers but was struck down by Underwood as he entered the front sitting room, where his mother lay. The door to the bedroom where the women had taken refuge was smashed open, but Kurz and the two Morby girls managed to escape through a window. However, 19-year-old Elsie Clark was caught and brutally attacked with a boondie, sustaining severe injuries to her face and head. After escaping through the window, Kurz and the two girls ran toward the inn. Jimmy chased after them, catching up with Kurz and Grace. He killed Kurz and left Grace mortally wounded, using both the tomahawk and boondie. Hilda, who was ahead of the others, tripped and fell down a steep creek bank. Jimmy caught her and delivered repeated blows with his boondie, crushing her skull. Amid the confusion, young Bert Morby had managed to slip out of the house unnoticed. Terrified, he hid in the bushes near the creek before running to the old inn to alert his father. John Morby grabbed his gun and rushed to the house, followed by his son Reggie and Fred Clark. They arrived within 10 minutes of the attack, but the assailants had already fled. The only family members left unharmed were Bert, his cousin George, who had hidden under a bed, and the two youngest children, who had been sleeping in a separate kitchen behind the house. Percy, Hilda, and Kurz were dead. Grace survived for 2 days before succumbing to her injuries. Sarah Morby, the children's mother, suffered multiple tomahawk wounds and died on July 24. Elsie Clark survived but was left permanently deaf from the blows she endured. This event, known as the Breelong Massacre, marked the beginning of a 3-month manhunt that would grip the nation. The days following the murders, the Governor brothers and Underwood travelled southeast, reaching Granby Station, where they narrowly avoided being spotted by a group of armed men. That evening, near Mendoran, they encountered a selector named Issen, an acquaintance of Jimmy's. Unaware of the murders, Issen provided the men with food. The following day, the fugitives were seen by William Davidson, a sleeper cutter, north of Junedo. Davidson fired several shots at them, forcing the group to flee into the bush. A swag left behind at the scene contained a blood-stained tomahawk and boondie. So, the first question is what happened to Underwood? During their escape, the Governor brothers either split from Underwood or the older man, who was somewhat lame, fell behind. In any case, Underwood found himself alone. On the 24th of July, Underwood was walking without food or blankets. He called at William Shaw's selection near Leadville. Claiming his name was Charlie Brown, he said he had come from Wellington and hadn't eaten in 3 days. Now Shaw was a smart man, he suspected his visitor was one of the murderers and sent his wife to a nearby selection to get help. Underwood was captured. He was initially held in custody at Mudgee with the expectation the Governor brothers would be soon apprehended and a single trial held, but when that did not eventuate, legal proceedings were initiated against him. On 18th of August 1900, he was taken by train to Dubbo and thence to Gilgandra, in which district the principal witnesses reside. He appeared before the Gilgandra Police Court on August 22, charged with murdering members of the Morby family and Ellen Kurz at Breelong. What happened to Ethel immediately after the murders? After the murders, Jimmy instructed Ethel to take their baby and head to Dubbo. Ethel walked through the bush until she reached the Dubbo Road, where she was intercepted by a group of armed men on their way to Gilgandra to join the search for the Breelong murderers. She was taken back to the Morby property and locked in a room at the Old Inn with Porter and young Peter, who had also been separated from Jimmy and the others. They remained in custody until the day before Underwood's trial, but the Attorney General dropped the charges against them, as their testimony was needed for that trial. Ethel testified in court, but Porter and Peter Governor were excluded as witnesses after it was determined they did not fully grasp the concept of taking an oath. Their crimes were powered by a combination of desperation, revenge, and a desire to evade capture. On the evening of July 22, the Governor boys were seen riding bareback on a grey horse near Slapdash Creek. They spent the night in a hut near Charlie Wade's house on Talawan Creek after being given food. The next morning, they headed east toward Ulan, 13 miles northeast of Gulgong. By early afternoon on July 23, the brothers arrived at Alexander McKay's farm at Sportsman's Hollow, 2 miles from Ulan. The 70-year-old farmer was pruning a fig tree when the brothers approached, armed with a rifle and tomahawk. Jimmy struck McKay with the tomahawk, mortally wounding him. The brothers then threatened McKay's wife, Mary, and 18-year-old Louisa Johnson, who were in the house. Jimmy attacked Mary with a stick, fracturing her temple, but she managed to get inside. The governors broke windows, entered the house, stole money and clothes, and fled on a stolen horse. McKay died shortly after being carried inside. This marked the first instance of Jimmy targeting someone for past grievances. Ethel had previously provided police with a list of 15 potential victims Jimmy sought to punish. Jimmy's attack on McKay was motivated by revenge, as McKay had once accused him of dishonesty years earlier, likely related to Jimmy's 1893 horse-stealing charge. After leaving the Mackay farm, the Governor brothers were seen near Yulin, where they stole a horse, giving them one each. They spoke to 2 Indian hawkers, asking them to leave ammunition near Walla, hinting they planned to kill Harry Neville. That night, they broke into Neville's empty house at Crowey Run, stealing a saddle and gun, but Neville had already left, suspecting their visit. The next day, July 24, the brothers dodged the planned ammunition drop-off, where police were waiting, and headed east. By mid-morning, they arrived at Michael O'Brien's selection at Poddy, 18 miles southwest of Merriwa. Elizabeth O'Brien, her teenage son James, and nurse Catherine Bennett were in the kitchen. Jimmy fired at them, shooting Elizabeth and Bennett multiple times, while Joe struck Elizabeth fatally with a tomahawk. Jimmy beat James to death with his rifle, breaking the stock. The brothers ransacked the house, stealing money, clothes, and boots, and left a threatening note on a blank check. Bennett, though severely wounded, managed to alert Michael O'Brien, who sought help. Police arrived hours later, but the brothers had fled. The attack was reportedly motivated by a grudge Jimmy held after O'Brien had humiliated him years earlier during a cricket match by dunking him in a creek. On July 25, a £200 reward was offered for each brother's capture, following the murders at Breelong and Poddy. The next day, they broke into Thomas Hughes' empty house, stealing a Winchester rifle and ammunition. They then targeted Clear and Fitzpatrick's farm near Walla, believing Fitzpatrick had poisoned their dogs years earlier. When Fitzpatrick, 74, came out armed, Joe shot him in the shoulder, and Jimmy killed him with an axe. Fitzpatrick's nephew Bernard, hearing the shot, returned, fired at the brothers, and fled to Walla for help. After the Fitzpatrick murder near Walla, the town became a focal point for police and media attention, especially since the governor's mother and younger siblings lived on the local Aboriginal reserve. A visitor in late July described the scene. "When we rode into town, we saw men armed to the teeth, patrolling vigilantly for any sign of the fugitives. Police had gathered all local Aboriginal people into the town for surveillance, locking them in a hall at night. Fear gripped the district, with families from surrounding areas fleeing to Walla for safety. The town was overwhelmed, as every available space was crammed with people seeking refuge." On July 29, a Chinese man's hut was robbed near Gulgong. The next day, the governors were spotted at 2 Mile Flat, 12 miles from Gulgong. Later, they were camped near Yambal when a group of pursuers surprised them while they were cooking. Their tracks disappeared near the Kagegong River at Gooma, and for about a week, there was no trace of them. By then, a large force of police and civilian volunteers, including 6 Queensland black trackers led by Sub-Inspector Galbraith, had joined the search. Over the next 3 months, the Governor brothers, now calling themselves Bushrangers, continued a spree of break-ins, robberies, and assaults. The governor's knowledge of the bush and their ability to move quickly through the rugged terrain made them elusive targets for the authorities. The Governor brothers were spotted near the Forbes River. 3 men, Herbert Bias, a kangaroo shooter, and Robert Wood, both involved in the hunt since late July, were stationed in a house on Edward Coombs' selection at Big Flat, anticipating the fugitives' arrival. In the afternoon, the brothers were seen descending a ridge toward the house. They approached cautiously, but when they got within 60 yards, they suddenly bolted. Bias fired through a crack in the wall, hitting Jimmy in the mouth and knocking out 4 teeth. Wood also shot Jimmy in the buttock. Despite his injuries, Jimmy and Joe escaped into the forest. Bias and Wood pursued briefly but gave up as darkness fell. Wounded, Jimmy and Joe hid in the bush for 3 days. On October 16, they ambushed 19-year-old William Coombs while he was chopping wood on his family's property. They forced him to go to his uncle's house for food, but Constable Dolman, guarding the house, prevented Coombs from returning. Coombs reported that Jimmy was weak, struggling to walk, with a cut lip, swollen tongue, and bandaged face. The next day, the brothers were seen near George Brinston's house on the Hastings River. Constable Young and a tracker opened fire, causing the brothers to separate. Jimmy later recalled that Joe ran away down the other side of the river, and that was the last I saw of him. The police strategy of occupying houses and cutting off the brothers' access to food was proving effective. During their time as fugitives, the governors became folk heroes to some, particularly among the working class and indigenous communities, who saw them as rebels fighting against a system that oppressed them. However, their violent actions also instilled fear and outrage among the wider population, leading to one of the largest manhunts in Australian history. After separating from his brother, Jimmy Governor headed south into the mountains, while Joe continued moving in the same direction. Jimmy, weakened by his gunshot wound to the mouth, struggled to eat and survived on honey and water for 14 days. Armed with only a Winchester rifle and 2 bullets, he hid near Bobin for about a week, scavenging for food. On October 27, John Wallace, the Bobin postmaster, discovered his tucker bag and Billy missing from his campsite. Suspecting the governors, Wallace gathered a group of 7 men and set up an ambush. At dawn, they spotted Jimmy near the creek. When challenged, Jimmy fled but was shot in the thigh during the chase. After being captured, he remarked that he gave credit to the fellows that caught him, as he believed the police couldn't run down a poddy calf. Jimmy was taken to Wingham, where 40 pellets were removed from his superficial wounds. On October 30, Jimmy was charged with the murder of Ellen Kurz in Wingham. He was later transported to Sydney aboard the steamer Electra, arriving on November 2 and taken to Darlinghurst Gaol. Meanwhile, Joe Governor was spotted near Talbrook Creek on October 30. John Wilkinson and his brother investigated a fire in a gully and found Joe sleeping. Wilkinson fired at Joe, who fled but was eventually shot dead by Wilkinson after a chase through rough terrain. Joe's death marked the end of the Governor brothers' violent spree. When Joe Governor's body was laid out on a table of Singleton's Caledonian Hotel, several hundred curious people gathered to gaze at it. Jackie Underwood was executed at Dubbo Jail on the 14th of January 1901, 3.5 months after his capture. Jimmy Governor was found guilty of murder and hanged at Darlinghurst Jail on January 18, 1901. A little over a month after Jimmy Governor's execution, wax figures depicting Joe and Jimmy Governor and their victims were displayed at the Waxworks in Kalgoorlie, Western Australia. It is believed that the Governor brothers may have committed over 80 crimes in a short period, including many murders, assaults and the rape of a 15-year-old girl at a farm at Cobark Creek. Jimmy Governor's story is a complex and controversial chapter in Australian history. On one hand, he was a savage and violent criminal whose actions caused immense suffering. On the other hand, his life highlights the systemic racism and social inequality that plagued colonial Australia. Governor's crimes were, in many ways, a response to the discrimination and mistreatment he faced as an Indigenous man in a predominantly white society. His marriage to a white woman, which defied the racial norms of the time, further alienated him from the community and contributed to his sense of isolation and anger. The story of Jimmy Governor has been immortalised in Australian literature and folklore. Thomas Keneally's novel The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, published in 1972, is loosely based on Governor's life and explores themes of racial injustice and social alienation. The novel was later adapted into a critically acclaimed film in 1978, bringing Governor's story to a wider audience. Governor's story is a tragic one, and as I was researching it, my attitude towards him shifted from that poor man and those poor people to how could they be such animals. I understand their anger and perhaps even his need for revenge, but he seemed to lose his heart and soul. The story reflects the struggles of the Indigenous Australians in that society. A society that often denied them justice and equality. We need to learn from history and accept the reality that all Australians are equal and should be treated as such. Today, his legacy serves as a powerful reminder of the need to acknowledge the injustices of the past, ensuring that such stories are not forgotten. Okay, so what happened to Ethel? Following her release from jail before Underwood's trial in October 1900, Ethel Governor and her child were taken in by a charitable institution in Sydney. She visited Jimmy in prison several times before his execution. Pregnant at the time, Ethel gave birth to a daughter in April 1901 in Wollongong. Ethel named her daughter Thelma, known as Violet. Sydney was adopted and changed his name from Governor to Duncan. The reason why he was adopted out and his sister wasn't is unknown. In November of that year, she married Frank Brown, a part Aboriginal man, sparking racist commentary in the press. One article condemned the union, saying that it was just as repulsive as the first, and lamented the inevitable consequence of adding to the piebald of a white Australia. Ethel and Frank had 11 children together. She outlived Frank and passed away in October 1945, buried in Rookwood Cemetery.